It was 1:30 in the morning when the first planes crossed the French coastline, and inside those aircraft, men were standing in the dark with 80 pounds of gear strapped to their bodies, waiting for a green light that would send them into a night that none of them could fully see. Below was Normandy. Below was occupied France. And below, though they didn't know it yet, was something far more dangerous than the mission briefings had prepared them for. The Allied plan for the airborne invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, was built on precision. Pathfinders would land first, mark the drop zones with lights and radar beacons, and the main formations of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions would follow, thousands of paratroopers descending in organized sticks, landing within walking distance of their objectives, assembling quickly, and striking before the Germans could respond. That was the plan. What happened instead was something closer to controlled chaos, and for many of those men, it was something closer to chaos with no control at all. German anti-aircraft fire tore into the C-47 formations almost immediately. Pilots, trained to fly in tight formation, began breaking away from their flight paths to avoid flak bursts lighting up the sky like deadly fireworks. Aircraft accelerated. Aircraft climbed. Aircraft veered left and right. And inside those planes, soldiers who were already standing at the door, ready to jump, were being thrown off balance, some knocked off their feet entirely, as pilots fought to keep their aircraft alive. When the green light finally came on, many jumped not over their designated drop zones, but over fields, marshes, flooded lowlands, and hedgerow country that bore no resemblance to the terrain maps they had memorized for months. Some were dropped over the open English Channel. Some were dropped miles from any other American soldier. And some landed directly on top of German positions, their parachutes collapsing over enemy rooftops before they ever had a chance to draw a weapon. The dispersion was staggering. Soldiers from the 101st Airborne were scattered across an area of roughly 25 by 15 miles. Men from the 82nd ended up in towns and fields they had never studied. Entire platoons were gone before they ever assembled, either killed on the jump, drowned in the flooded fields that German engineers had deliberately inundated along the Murderette and Douve rivers, or captured within minutes of landing. Of the approximately 13,000 American paratroopers dropped into Normandy that night, a significant portion landed alone, or nearly alone, in enemy-held territory with no immediate contact with friendly forces, no clear orientation, and no way of knowing whether anyone else had survived at all. It was in that darkness, scattered, disoriented, often alone, that something unexpected began to happen. Something that no training manual had fully anticipated and no commander had formally ordered. The paratroopers began to find each other. Not by radio. Not by flares. Not by any of the organized assembly procedures they had rehearsed back in England. They found each other by sound. By instinct. By the small metal crickets, those simple, cheap toy clickers issued to American paratroopers before the jump, that became, in those first terrifying hours, the difference between friend and bullet. One click meant, I am here. 2 clicks meant, I hear you. And somewhere in the hedgerows and the apple orchards and the dark lanes of the Norman countryside, men who had never spoken to each other began forming the most improvised fighting units in American military history. A sergeant from Ohio might land 50 yards from a private from Georgia they had never met. A lieutenant from the 101st might stumble across 2 enlisted men from the 82nd, a completely different division, and, because they were all American and all armed and all very much behind enemy lines, that became enough. Rank still mattered. Training still mattered. But the unit designations that had defined their entire military identity suddenly mattered far less than the simple, urgent fact of not being alone in the dark. These improvised groups, sometimes 3 men, sometimes 8 or 10, rarely more than a platoon's worth, began moving through the night with a clarity of purpose that their scattered condition might have made impossible. They had objectives. They had weapons. And now, at least, they had each other. If you've never served in the military, it might be hard to understand just how profoundly disorienting it is to be dropped into enemy territory without your unit. The American Army of 1944 was built on the cohesion of small groups, squads and platoons where men knew each other's habits, trusted each other's instincts, and had rehearsed their movements together until those movements became almost automatic. Strip that away, drop a man into a dark field alone, and you have someone who is technically still a soldier but who has lost the entire framework that made his training functional. What the paratroopers of D-Day demonstrated, in those first hours, was something that military historians have studied ever since, that sufficiently trained men, when thrown together by circumstance, can rebuild that framework almost from scratch. Not perfectly. Not without friction. But fast enough to fight. And in Normandy, fast enough to fight was all that was needed. These makeshift units had one thing working powerfully in their favor: the Germans had no idea where they were. The scatter that had seemed like a catastrophic failure of the Allied plan was, in a deeply ironic way, also one of its most effective elements. German commanders in Normandy that night were receiving reports of paratroopers landing in dozens of different locations simultaneously, some accurate, many wildly confused, all of them contradictory. What was actually the result of navigational failure and anti-aircraft evasion looked, from the German side, like a deliberate and sophisticated deception. A German officer attempting to respond to the airborne landings that night had no clear picture of where the main American force was, because there was no main American force in the conventional sense. There were hundreds of small groups, moving through the darkness in every direction, attacking whatever they found and disappearing back into the hedgerows before a response could be organized. The chaos, in other words, had become a weapon. And if you want to understand how those men survived, not just that night, but across the days that followed, then you need to understand something that goes beyond tactics and training in military doctrine. You need to understand what it means to make a decision in the dark, with incomplete information, surrounded by an enemy that outnumbers you, in a country you have never visited, in a language you do not speak, knowing that the difference between the right choice and the wrong one might be measured in seconds. The paratroopers of D-Day made those decisions, over and over, across the fields and villages of Normandy. And most of them made the right call. This video is about how, and why. If the history of D-Day matters to you, if these stories of ordinary men doing extraordinary things under impossible conditions are the kind of history you want to keep exploring, consider subscribing. There's a lot more where this came from, and every video is built to go deep. The hedgerows of Normandy were ancient. Some of them had been growing for centuries, thick earthen banks topped with dense tangles of root and brush, forming walls that divided the Norman countryside into a maze of small enclosed fields that the French called bocage. For a farmer, they were boundaries. For an army trying to maneuver, they were a nightmare. But for a small group of paratroopers operating behind enemy lines with no artillery support and no armor, they were something else entirely: cover, concealment, and the foundation of an entirely different kind of warfare. The men who had assembled into these improvised units quickly understood something that larger conventional forces could not easily exploit. They were small enough to move without being heard. They were scattered enough that the Germans couldn't locate them by tracking a single formation. And they were trained, every one of them, in the kind of aggressive, initiative-driven tactics that American airborne doctrine had emphasized since the early days of the war. They didn't wait to be found. They moved. They probed. They struck. Ambushes became their primary weapon. A group of 5 or 6 paratroopers could position themselves along a sunken road, wait for a German patrol or a supply column, open fire with everything they had, and vanish into the bocage before a response could be organized. The Germans had to treat every lane, every tree line, every farmyard as a potential threat. That kind of Constant uncertainty is exhausting, and it is strategically crippling. Units that should have been moving toward the beaches to reinforce coastal defenses were instead being held in place, waiting for a threat that seemed to come from everywhere at once. There was a psychological dimension to this that went beyond tactics. The German soldiers stationed in Normandy in June 1944 were not all elite troops. Many were older men, or soldiers transferred from the Eastern Front with wounds that hadn't fully healed, or conscripts from occupied nations who had no particular desire to die for the Third Reich. When word spread that American paratroopers were operating freely behind the lines, appearing without warning, striking, and disappearing, it created a level of anxiety that degraded unit cohesion in ways that no frontal assault could have matched. Fear of the unseen enemy is a force multiplier. The paratroopers understood this intuitively, even if they never would have described it in those terms. Some of these small units went beyond ambushes. Groups of paratroopers captured crossroads, held bridges, seized causeways that would prove critical when the beach landings began later that morning. A handful of men from the 101st Airborne secured the western exits of Utah Beach, narrow causeways crossing flooded lowlands, without which the soldiers landing on that beach would have been trapped between the water and the Germans with nowhere to go. Those causeway actions were not carried out by full battalions following a coordinated plan. They were carried out by small groups of men who had found each other in the dark, identified an objective, and taken it. The scale was small. The consequences were enormous. They moved through a country that was not theirs, in a language they did not speak, among a civilian population that had every reason to be cautious. 5 years of German occupation had taught the French that helping the wrong person, or being seen helping the wrong person, could mean arrest, deportation, or death. And yet, in farmhouse after farmhouse across the Norman countryside, doors opened. It didn't always begin with words. Sometimes it was a farmer pointing silently toward a road, indicating German positions without making a sound. Sometimes it was a woman placing food on a windowsill and walking back inside without turning around. Small gestures, almost invisible, carried an enormous personal risk. The French resistance in Normandy was not a single organized force with a chain of command and a communications network. It was a web of individuals in small cells who had been waiting, some of them for years, for exactly this moment. And when the paratroopers began appearing in their fields and barns in the early hours of June 6, many of those individuals made their choice quickly and without hesitation. The intelligence the resistance provided was often the difference between a patrol that walked into an ambush and one that avoided it entirely. Local guides knew which roads were patrolled and when. They knew which farmhouses were being used as German billets. They knew the flooded areas, the hidden paths through the bocage, the locations of German command posts that no aerial photograph had captured with enough detail to be useful. For paratroopers operating without maps that matched the reality on the ground, many had landed so far off course that their maps were nearly useless. A local contact who could orient them in 60 seconds was worth more than an entire intelligence briefing back in England. There were also practical forms of support that rarely appear in the dramatic retellings of D-Day. Civilian clothing for paratroopers who needed to move through a village without drawing immediate fire. Food and water for men who had been fighting for 12 or 18 hours on nothing but what they had carried in their pockets. Hiding spaces, in haystacks, in cellars, in the spaces beneath floorboards, for wounded men who could not be moved but could not be left in the open. The French civilians who provided these things did so knowing that a German search party finding an American soldier on their property was a death sentence. That knowledge did not stop most of them. What made this network function under such pressure was something that had been built long before June 6. The French resistance had been cultivated, supplied, and coordinated, imperfectly, but persistently, by the British Special Operations Executive and the American Office of Strategic Services. Weapons had been dropped by parachute in the months before the invasion. Codes had been established. In the days immediately before D-Day, BBC radio broadcasts had carried prearranged messages, lines of poetry, fragments of songs, that told resistance cells across France that the invasion was imminent and that it was time to act. The paratroopers who landed in Normandy were not dropping into a completely hostile void. They were dropping into a landscape that had, quietly and at great cost, been partially prepared to receive them. By the afternoon of June 6, the character of the fighting in Normandy had begun to shift. The beach landings were ashore, some more securely than others, and the urgent, existential question of whether the invasion would survive its first hours had been answered. It would survive. But for the paratroopers who had been operating in isolation since before dawn, the consolidation that followed brought its own kind of reckoning. Units began to find each other. Officers began to piece together what had happened, who was missing, and what had actually been accomplished during those chaotic hours before anyone had a clear picture of the battlefield. What emerged was a story full of contradictions. The airborne operation had been, by any conventional measure, a serious failure of execution. Drop zones had been missed by miles. Units had been shattered before they ever assembled. Equipment bundles carrying heavy weapons, mortars, anti-tank guns, radios, had sunk in flooded fields or landed so far from their intended locations that they were never recovered. Several battalions fought through the entire first day of the invasion at a fraction of their intended strength, led by whoever happened to be the senior surviving officer, working from incomplete information and improvised plans. The human cost was severe. Exact casualty figures for the airborne divisions on D-Day remain difficult to establish with precision, but estimates suggest the 82nd and 101st together suffered somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 casualties in the first 24 hours, killed, wounded, captured, or missing. And yet the objectives, the ones that truly mattered, had largely been achieved. The causeways behind Utah Beach had been secured. Key road junctions had been seized or contested. German reserve units that should have reached the beaches in the critical early hours had been delayed, diverted, or simply pinned down by the constant pressure of paratroopers they could not locate or predict. The town of Saint-Mère-Église, one of the first French towns liberated on D-Day, had been taken and held by elements of the 82nd Airborne despite the disaster of the initial drop, including the now famous incident in which Private John Steele's parachute caught on the church steeple, leaving him hanging above the town square while the battle raged below him. The airborne contribution to the success of the Normandy landings was real, even if it looked almost nothing like what had been planned. Military historians have spent decades analyzing what the D-Day airborne operation reveals about the nature of small unit cohesion, individual initiative, and the limits of centralized planning in combat. What the paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st demonstrated on June 6 was that training, when it goes deep enough, produces something that survives the destruction of the structure it was built around. These men had been trained to make decisions independently, to take initiative when leadership was absent, to treat uncertainty as a condition to be managed rather than a problem to be solved. When everything else was stripped away, their units, their maps, their communications, their planned objectives, what remained was that training, and the character it had built. It was enough. Barely, in some cases. But enough. There is something in that worth sitting with. Not as military strategy, but as a human truth. The paratroopers who survived alone behind enemy lines in Normandy did not survive because conditions cooperated with them. They survived because they had been prepared, at a level deep enough to hold under pressure, for conditions that cooperated with nothing. They improvised because they had to. They led because someone had to. They moved toward the sound of the guns, in the dark, in a country they had never visited, because the alternative was to stay still and wait, and staying still, they understood, was the one thing they could not afford to do. That understanding, carried by thousands of individual men across a single night in June 1944, helped change the course of the war.